Thank you very much, everybody, for turning out this evening. So I'm going to go through a little bit on Vicoxin, the what, the how, and the why. And if it's okay with everybody, I'm going to turn off my camera just to save with bandwidth, just in case that it drags me down. Okay, so hopefully it'll flick on to the next slide. So I'm going to start off with a little bit on what is Vicoxin. So Vicoxin is a white oral suspension that contains diglycerol at 2.5 milligrams per ml, and it's given to both lambs and calves at a 1 ml per 2.5 kg body weight in a single oral administration. The good news about Vicoxin is that it has a zero meat withdrawal. I suppose that's not overly important for calves unless you're in veal production, but for lambs, especially fattening lambs and store lambs, that can be a significant factor for those animals. Shelf life is 3 months after opening, and it's advised not to freeze the product. So a little bit then on Vicoxin and how to use it. So I suppose when we're thinking about Vicoxin, we need to think about when we actually see disease. So for baby lambs, really, we start to see clinical signs in them from about 4 weeks of age, and in calves, as Owen already mentioned, as young as 3 weeks old. I suppose after about a year old, most bovines have immunity. So we see most of the clinical signs in calves up to 6 months. However, occasionally we do see it in slightly older animals. And I suppose the question is, why does this actually happen? No one's already spoken about immunity. So I suppose the important thing is that animals, when they're born, they have no immunity to coccidiosis, and therefore they do need exposure to the parasite to actually develop that immunity. And this slide highlights the series of events that happens to lambs, but it's also the same principles actually occur in calves as well. In newborn animals, they do get their protection from their mother's colostrum in the form of maternally derived antibodies for a few weeks, and that's partially protective. But they really are susceptible to disease while they build up their own immunity. And this graph highlights that the oocysts are continuously excreted by the yolks and by the dam at very low levels throughout life, even though they actually have good immunity themselves to coccidiosis. And this low level of oocyst excretion is the constant source of contamination to the environment that affects the young lambs and calves soon after birth. And then once this protection from their mother wanes, then you can see that the oocyst excretion starts to increase after a few weeks. So it's usually around about 3 to 4 weeks. After being infected, then that allows the animal to actually start developing its own immunity. But there is a period in between, I suppose, a window of opportunity where the young lamb or calf is extremely vulnerable to disease. And that's illustrated on this slide by those little purple bricks that you can see. So when we come on to the theory of treatment, and what we're aiming to achieve, we're really ideally trying to help the animal avoid disease while they develop their own natural immunity. Remember, as Owen's already mentioned, stress does affect immunity. So things like bad weather, overcrowding, poor nutrition, other infections, maybe such as bovine respiratory disease or other pathogens that cause diarrhea, or internal parasites such as nematodirus in lambs. Unfortunately, this can extend the window of opportunity and delay the onset of natural protection in that animal. So I suppose control of coccidiosis, it's a delicate balance between the animal's own immunity and developing resistance, along with minimizing the infectious pressure on that animal. For animals to become immune, they must become exposed to all stages of the life cycle, but they are, of course, at risk clinical disease throughout that period. So controlled exposure will allow the animal to develop immunity. However, if there's an imbalance, so if there's a lot of stress during a time where there's infectious pressure, especially in an animal that has no immunity or has delayed immunity due to concurrent disease, etc., that's when we can often see clinical outbreaks and production loss. So I suppose that's when our therapeutic agents come in, that we can try to minimize those production losses through the use of a product such as Vicoxin. So the principle of coccidiosis treatment is to control the level of challenge to prevent disease, but still allow enough exposure so that young animals can develop immunity. In terms of timing of the actual dose, I suppose, unfortunately, there is no one size fits all advice. So a lot of the time we are going based on information that we have to hand from the farmer. So I suppose ideally we would have some historical information from the farmer. This does require good record keeping and knowledge, previous knowledge of outbreaks. And so if we have that on hand, the advice to that farmer would be to treat that group of animals 1 week before the expected clinical signs occur. And what that will do is it will allow the animals to become exposed and develop immunity to all the stages of the life cycle of the coccidiosis, but we're trying to come in and kill the parasite in the lining of the guts so that we don't have those clinical signs. The next group then are those that are unknown. So we've unknown history in terms of exposure, we've unknown idea about the level of environmental infectious pressure, and we also aren't too sure in terms of the level of stress that has occurred or may occur in the coming weeks. So the advice is there for those animals, if we're turning them out onto questionable pasture or say a dirty environment where we expect coccidiosis to be, the advice there is to treat those animals around about 2 weeks after exposure. Again, allowing the animal to be exposed, develop their own natural immunity, and then using the coccidiosis then to kill the parasite in the lining of the guts. Alternatively then, another option would be to treat at the time of stress. Remember that we said earlier, stress actually can impact on the development of immunity. Therefore, if there's a stressful time such as dehorning, castration, weaning, or maybe mixing age groups, etc., that could be a particular time of stress, and the advice would be to dose at that time. The third option then is at the first signs of clinical outbreak. So if we have an animal in the group that is showing signs of coccidiosis, then the advice is to treat the entire group when we see the first lamb or calf with signs of coccidiosis. And I suppose Owen's already mentioned this, but the advice for all three options is to always treat the whole group, because remember, coccidiosis is not an individual animal issue, it's an entire group disease, and all of the animals will become exposed to the same amount of infectious pressure and the same stressors at pretty much the same time. So when we're seeing clinical signs in one, the likelihood is that the life cycle is completing in other animals in that group. In terms of treating in the face of a group, in terms of treating in the face of a disease outbreak, one dose of coccidiosis is enough to protect those animals because their own natural immunity should develop if there is exposure. As we mentioned though, if there's prolonged stress, it may be necessary to repeat the dose if the animals haven't developed that immunity due to that prolonged period of stress. So a second dose can be given 3 weeks later. Just to touch on some specific groups within farms at the minute, I suppose we have a lot of dairy calves hitting the ground at the minute, so you might particularly get asked about some of these groups. I suppose for dairy calves, again, the earliest period really of risk for those animals would be from about 3 weeks old. So ideally, we would go in every week and treat all of the susceptible animals, and that would be those that are 3 weeks old. However, there would be a huge amount of labour implications there. So that's probably not going to happen in reality. So what might be doable is that the farmer might opt to treat every 2 weeks. And so all of the calves that are between 3 to 4 weeks of age will get a dose at that particular event. And then 2 weeks later, then a different set of animals coming along in the susceptible age group between 3 to 4 weeks old will get a dose of coccidiosis, and every 2 weeks moving forward. And hopefully then those animals will have already developed immunity and they won't need any further treatments. For bought-in calves, then for anyone that's buying in calves from a dairy farm, the advice would be to treat upon arrival, because again, these would probably fall into the unknown group or the group that are exposed to stress. So the advice would be to treat these animals upon arrival, and then that will kill any of the parasites that are in their guts. Moving on then to the question, why Vicoxin? So why do you choose Vicoxin? I'd just like to go through two studies, if that's okay. So this is the first study that the authors compared the efficacy of vicoxin, which is diclazuril, versus toltrazuril and Baycox bovis in this study against natural infections of Emeria bovis and Emeria zearni in calves. And in this study, they had 199 calves aged between 21 and 55 days old, and they were kept on 9 different farms with a history of coccidiosis. The animals were assigned to 3 different groups. So there was the vicoxin treated group, the Baycox bovis treated group, and then there was the control group that received no treatment at all. The calves were observed then for 78 days following the treatment, and they were monitored for oocyst excretion, their fecal scores, as well as their average daily weight gain. In terms of the results then, oocyst excretion or shedding was monitored through twice weekly fecal examinations. And you can see here the green line. Let me just try and get my little pointer here. This is the mean log total oocyst excretion per gram of feces, and the green line is the control group. And you can see throughout the study, oocysts were excreted, and that indicates that there was constant challenge throughout the study period. Between day 12 and day 26, that is when there was the highest mean oocyst excretion throughout the study. In terms of the number of diarrhea days, there was no real difference between the calves that experienced diarrhea days between the 2 treatment groups. So they had quite a low incidence of diarrhea versus the control group, which had significantly more diarrhea days. So there was no statistical difference between the 2 treatment groups. There was a difference, however, in weight gain. And you can see here across all 9 farms that the animals that had received diclazuril had a higher average daily gain compared to those that received toltrazuril. Toltrazuril. Baycox. Sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied here. In terms of the weight gain then, just to sort of amalgamate all of the 5 or the 9 sites together, you can see here across the study that the metaphylactic treatment with both diclazuril and toltrazuril reduces the impact of coccidiosis, but those calves that received diclazuril had a higher average daily gain of 57 grams per kilo per day. In terms then of the study conclusions, so why were there better results seen then from those calves that received vicoxin? I suppose the differences are as a result of the pharmacokinetic properties between diclazuril and toltrazuril. And really the difference is in the dose rate. So you have a difference of 1 milligram per kg, and the half-life for vicoxin is 30 hours versus toltrazuril, which has a concentration treatment dosage rate of 15 milligrams per kilo and a half-life of 2.5 days and subsequent periods of activity. So a key finding in this study was that the Baycox bovis treated calves were more susceptible to infection from 30 days post-treatment compared to those calves that received vicoxin. And the authors believe that the duration of action of the diclazuril treated calves appeared to allow a better degree of exposure to the Emeria species to allow those animals to develop species-specific protective immunity. The second study then, this is quite a similar study in that the authors again compared the efficacy of diclazuril and toltrazuril in the prevention of bovine coccidiosis. There were 86 calves in this study. Again, they were between 5 and 6 weeks old. And quite similarly, the calves were monitored for the same length of time, so 78 days following treatment. And again, they were observed for clinical observation, body weight, and fecal oocyst excretion. Study results for this study showed that actually there was no significant difference between the 2 treatment groups in terms of body weight. However, there was a difference in the number of diarrhea days. So there was no difference in the diarrhea days between all 3 groups between days 1 to day 41. However, from day 42, the vicoxin treated group showed only 1 diarrhea day compared to 9 and 18 days for the control and toltrazuril treated groups respectively. Just in terms of the actual results here, you can see on the graph on your right-hand side, the untreated group showed that basically there was continuous exposure throughout the challenge. So in the control group, you can see that there was continuous oocysts picked up in the feces. In the diglazural treated group, the fecal oocyst count declined to low levels following treatment. However, there was a few days between day 27 and 42 where there was oocyst counts occasionally greater than 500 oocysts per gram, but they remained low thereafter. The group that received toltrazuril showed quite low fecal oocyst counts up until day 40, but then showed several peaks thereafter, and these actually coincided with actual clinical signs. So I suppose again this brings us back to the low fecal oocyst output following the toltrazuril really probably did impact on the development of immunity, which led then those animals to be susceptible then to reinfection later on. A final comment then for Vicoxin, an additional benefit. So I suppose after use of toltrazuril, the metabolite of toltrazuril that's passed out in feces is toltrazuril sulfone, which is ponazuril as it can sometimes be called. And unfortunately, it has been shown to be very persistent in soil, so can survive for about around a year and can be quite mobile. And unfortunately, it is also toxic to plants. And there is a requirement for treated animals for their manure to be diluted with the manure of untreated or mature animals. The good news is that Vicoxin contains diglazural and it does not carry this environmental warning. So in summary then, why use Vicoxin? So Vicoxin is a flexible product. It can be used in both lambs and calves, and there's no restriction in terms of the weight or the age range that it can be used. It can be used in both dairy replacement heifer calves, dairy bull calves. It can be used in sucklers of all weights and ages, and as well as that in lambs, as well as those that are intensively reared. As we've seen from the studies, it allows both natural immunity to develop, and we've seen higher daily live weight gain following the use of diglazural. And the final point then, it is environmentally friendly, and we don't need to be concerned about any metabolites that could affect potentially soil or plant or wildlife. So I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and now I'll pass over to Jack. Thank you.
Great job, Sarah. Well done. You can just stop sharing the screen now at this point. Again, yeah, great job, Sarah. Lots of useful information on that, and there is questions after coming into the chat. So again, we might hold off until the end to answer those. So we're on schedule in terms of time. Next up, Bruce Thompson, dairy farmer in County Laois, and a 2020 Nuffield Scholar. With that, Bruce did his study on anthelmintic resistant control measures incorporating pasture management and dung beetles to increase biodiversity. Last week, myself and Emma Gilson, who's product manager in MSD Animal Health and who's responsible for pulling together this webinar, we visited Bruce out on his farm to talk through his farming system, his Nuffield scholarship, and the role the dung beetle can have in Ireland at pasture level. So we're going to play the video.
My name is Bruce Thompson. I'm a dairy farmer from County Laois. I am milking 320 cows in a spring calving grass-based system. In 2020 I completed a Nuffield scholarship looking at the free living stages of parasites and looking at how grazing strategies affected parasite loadings, and I was looking at how our management decisions around anthelmintics was affecting biodiversity, and looking at biological tools such as dung beetles and how they affected the parasite loadings on animals. So I chose this topic because myself and Dad found that as we were increasing the stock numbers on our farm, we were finding more incidences of disease. And one day, while myself and Dad were having a conversation beside the crush, we decided that we were heading the wrong direction with our anthelmintic usage and we had to adopt a different approach. So using more diagnostics, we found that we were able to reduce the amount of anthelmintics being used. At the same time, I had a conversation with Dr. Sally-Ann Spence over in the UK, who is an ecologist, and Dr. Sally-Ann Spence got me onto the idea that anthelmintics had a negative effect on dung beetles, but that dung beetles had a positive effect on reducing the parasite burdens on pasture. So by using less anthelmintics, we were encouraging the dung beetles, which in a cyclic fashion were reducing the parasite burdens.
So Bruce, we're out here with the cows. It's a lovely February morning. We've been talking about dung pats off camera. I suppose your Nuffield scholarship, anthelmintic use, and I suppose the role of the vet can play in that going forward as well. But before we get into all of that, do you want to just tell us a little bit where you travelled on your Nuffield scholarship?
I was very fortunate to get to travel around South Australia and Tasmania to look at what the farmers down there are doing, and their Department of Agriculture over there, CSIRO, the resources they've poured into tackling dung pats out in pasture. And yeah, down in Tasmania then looking at the urban issues that were problematic down there due to dung pats being left on pasture as well.
And Bruce, what were some of the key findings then, or what's going on there, particularly with the government and what they're doing to help improve the situation in those areas?
Yeah, in the late 18th century, white man arrived with his cattle and sheep into Australia, but didn't bring his dung beetles with him. So the issue was there was dung pats being left on pasture, which left a big fly burden initially, which went into urban areas and caused havoc with people trying to eat food outside and those sort of issues. And we're also finding pollutants in waterways. So they brought in species from Europe and South Africa, introduced them, mass reared them and let them out onto pasture to bury the dung pats into the soil. And they found that these beetles are actually playing a big role in reducing parasite loadings as well. I was also looking at grazing strategies in terms of anthelmintic resistance, because in the southern hemisphere anthelmintic resistance is further developed, so is their control strategies.
So Bruce, just here in Ireland then, from a farmer's perspective, what are the benefits for a farmer in terms of dung beetles?
Yeah, well the dung beetles have multiple benefits for farmers. They're breaking the life cycle of the parasite. So when a cow deposits a dung pat, which has parasite eggs in it onto pasture, the dung beetle is increasing the decaying rate of that dung pat into the soil by drying it out and encouraging earthworms and burying it into the soil. So they're reducing the worm burdens on pasture. They're also bringing that dung pat, which is a noxious weed sitting on top of the ground, into the soil where it is full of nutrients such as nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium. And in doing so they're aerating the soil by burrowing through it. And by removing that dung pat off of the top of the ground, they're increasing opportunity for grass to grow where it was previously covered by a dung pat. And also then there's the biodiversity advantages of it. The dung beetle is at the bottom of the food chain, so by having more dung beetles there, the birds such as coal tits and buzzards, and we were looking at a couple of buzzards flying around there a few minutes ago, they're all tucking into these dung beetles as well.
Just then, even on the dung pats, we heard Sarah talk about the different active ingredients, different anthelmintics. Some of them can be quite toxic or potent in the feces and in the dung. So for the dung beetle, essentially some of the dung pats can be tastier almost, is that the best way to say it, than others, due to the toxicity levels?
Yeah, well some of the dung pats apparently taste like crap, so we have to be careful what way we're serving them up. So yeah, some of the active ingredients that we're using on the animals pass through unmetabolized, so they're still active in the dung pats for a number of weeks after they've been administered, and these are toxic to dung beetles. So where the dung beetles are going to reduce our parasite burdens, if we're reducing the populations of the dung beetles with the wormers in the first place, then we're on a downward spiral. So it's a matter of knowing when to go in with it and using as much as is needed, but as little as possible.
And I suppose as well the correct active to do.
The correct active, correct job.
Disease, correct for the animal at the correct time as well.
Yes.
So we might even get in around a dung pat here next and kind of talk through what we're seeing from maybe start to finish of that cycle.
Yeah.
Bruce, we're down on our knees here having a look at the ground obviously, but could you want to actually talk us through what we're looking at here?
Okay, so this was a dung pat. So last November a cow deposited a dung pat here. We have two types of dung beetles in Ireland. We have the dwellers and we have tunnelers. The dwellers drink the dung pat dry and they lay their eggs just under the soil. In doing that, they make the dung pat more attractive to earthworms. So the earthworms then come and pull that dung pat into the soil and place it at the roots of the grass. 70% of the soil passes through an earthworm every year,
okay,
making phosphorus more available to grass. So they effectively are going to help us reduce our inputs.
And as you're saying, it pulls it down, so even if you want to get the spade and give that a shake up,
Yeah,
we should see earthworms.
We should see, as you can see, there's plenty of evidence of them. It's full of earthworm casks.
Yeah.
So if we pull this up here,
Luckily on camera that we do have one.
yeah.
At least, yeah.
So
And there's a few more here
yeah,
as well.
we have earthworms here.
Okay, and so the process is that they're pulling down that dung pat and kind of mixing that into the soil as such.
Turning cow poo into soil.
Yeah.
Really, very fertile soil. So as you can see, like there's loads of little holes from the earthworms in the soil, and here's our little friends then sitting on the spade there. So there's the earthworms. So they're really the final solution to a dung pat.
Okay.
And how, Bruce, does this then prevent parasites or affect the parasite cycle?
So the dung beetles, in drying the dung pat, don't lend to the life cycle of the parasite, because the parasite is aquatic. As they hatch, they swim out with the dung pat and get onto the grass to complete their life cycle by ingesting by cattle. So that's the first way. The second way is that the faster disintegration of the dung pat brings the actual eggs down into the soil where they can't complete their life cycle. So that's basically the way to cut out the life cycle. The other species that we haven't seen here yet are tunnelers, and they get the dung pat and bury it into the soil straight off in a quite spectacular fashion. So I've seen where they've removed dung pats in 3 days, which completely obliterates any chance of dung-borne parasites getting back into the animal.
So really then the dung beetle, it's a real benefit to the farmer but also the animal as well.
Yeah.
I guess from a farmer's perspective, it's nearly doing a job on its own of removing the dung pats, subsoiling them into the soil with the help of worms, but at the same time maybe reducing the need to top out paddocks, and particularly you're saying you don't do that here. Also fertiliser, artificial fertiliser may not be needed because it's allowing for that phosphorus to become available under the soil level.
Yeah, it's all win-win. Yeah, they really have a lot of little benefits.
Yeah.
But the big one would be the parasite. There's other ones then. Yeah, you're reduced topping, more opportunity of grass growth, reduced methane emissions. It all adds up. Yeah.
So Bruce, just in terms of your farm here, have you reduced the amount of antihelmintic products being used here since you started focusing your attention more on increasing your dung beetle populations?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the cows we see in the background here, they haven't been wormed since 2017. My maiden heifers haven't been wormed in 2 years, and we're working a targeted selective treatment system on calves. So there's actually quite a number. I think it's about 30% of those calves haven't got any antibiotic at all. So they have their own natural immunity to worms, and haven't needed to be wormed. And then the dung beetles then are lowering the pressure on pasture for those young stock. So yeah, we have a big reduction in antibiotic usage.
So they're definitely going to be a solution going forward to reducing antihelmintic use on farms. So
yeah, as part of an integrated parasite management, they are part of it. And look, antibiotics are going to be part of it, and grassland management. There's plenty of cogs in the wheel here. Like, we haven't got the days of just relying on antibiotics are behind us now. We need to move on and look at other options.
Bruce, now we're going to look at how you rear the beetles, in particular going through the cages and the process of how they get from here, I guess, and then out into the fields where they then eat or feed on the dung pats. So,
okay.
Through that.
Yeah. So what we do is basically we trap the beetles first, and we divide them into their own species.
Okay.
And we collect that species and put it into one tent here. This is a mass rearing tent that we have, and we put them in here, and we put them in with some nice tucker of cow poo. So you can see it's empty at the moment, but they're put in here and they're put into a tight confinement in large numbers with a small amount of food. So basically it's like Copper's nightclub at 10 to 2. Okay. Everyone's looking for food and a mate. Yeah. So they breed at a much higher rate, they find their mate a lot easier, and they actually they produce more eggs.
Okay.
So we're finding a replication rate of about 20 to 1 in here. and when the eggs have hatched and pupated, we leave the lid off, and that allows them to fly off across the farm. The purpose of the lid is to keep them in the confinement and protect them from predators as well.
In terms of distance then, so do they go a mile, 2 miles, or how far can these get up?
So we don't really know, but we do know that some of the species that were released into South Australia, the beetles were marked and were found 70 kilometres away.
Okay.
So they can travel quite a distance. Now the small beetles I'm breeding are probably realistically not going to travel much further than my own farm. So they have a good food source here with my cows. The cows have been kept here on the farm to feed the beetles basically. So yeah.
So Bruce, what's the purpose of this? Like, why would you bother breeding beetles in a cage on your farm?
Yeah, so so as my stock numbers have increased, it's hard for the dung beetle populations to up their ante as well. So this is basically to put more pressure onto the dung pats around the farm. So we're creating like a plague of locusts, except instead of for a crop, it's for dung pats, and that brings us all the benefits that we'd seen out in the pasture earlier.
And can this be upscaled into a larger scale or commercialised?
It can, of course, yeah. This is the sort of process I saw down in Australia and Tasmania. These can be done in larger volumes to increase populations in areas.
In terms of hours, or for other farmers to do it, was it hard to get set up here on your farm, and did it take long to actually make this a success?
Yeah, it did. Look, there's quite a bit of work in it. It does need a good bit of dedication to it, and there's stuff I'm learning the whole time as well as I go along. Plenty of mistakes. So 1 or 2 of the batches went wrong on me as well for different things.
Yeah. But in terms of the benefit then at pasture, it's probably worthwhile your hours and effort.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, definitely. The time I spent here, I haven't spent in a crush catching cows by the head.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So it's definitely feeding into that, improving biodiversity across your land area, but also sustainability, I guess, as well, not only for the drug and the products you're using, but also for the fields, the pastures, even the animals.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, every time less that I don't have to use a wormer is a time more it's going to work for me in the future. So it's basically the opposite of antibiotic resistance. It's slowing that down. In effect. Yeah.
Letting nature do it.
Letting nature do it, yeah, and then it's given back to nature. It really shows the benefits that my cows are bringing to the ecology.
Yeah.
They're leaving dung pats on the ground, which are a food source for insects, which are a food source for birds and badgers and foxes, and working in harmony with nature.
Yeah.
Bruce, from an emissions perspective, is there benefits of dung beetles breaking that dung pat down quickly?
Yes, there is actually. So a certain amount of methane actually comes off of the dung pat and is emitted from the dung pat when it's on pasture. So by the dung beetles putting a skin on top of it and disintegrating the pat quicker, there's less of that emitted into the atmosphere. Yes, it's hard to measure that and quantify it, but I know Dr. Eleanor Slade over in the UK has recently released a paper on it. So yeah, to do their thing, I suppose collectively is probably huge. The antibiotics we're using are going to play a very important role in the future of parasite control within our animals. So we need to ensure that their efficacy is protected. So we need to make sure that we don't get caught up with antibiotic resistance. In order to do that, we need to use as much as is needed, but as little as possible. The antibiotics also pose a threat to biodiversity, which plays into the control of parasites as well. The alternative ways that we can look at dealing with parasites is to incorporate targeted selective treatment within our animals. So we're completely integrating all areas and aspects of our parasite control. So we're looking at diagnostics, we're looking at the type of parasites we're dealing with, we're looking at the right products at the right time, the right amounts, and then we're looking at the grazing infrastructure on the farm, the planning, mapping out risks and trying to reduce those risks. And then of course we have biodiversity then that plays into that as well. We can undo a downward spiral into an upward spiral. The beetle itself it's like an indicator species. It shows a good indication of what is going on in terms of soil biodiversity on our farm. So we saw there today that where there's a good population of dung beetles, we have good healthy soil, earthworms and other insects that are rummaging through the soil. So they're a good indicator species, and they are themselves part of the whole ecology that we're dealing with on our farms on a daily basis. These beetles then are reducing the need on my farm for the use of anthelmintics and also the use of fly control products to a certain degree. So they're playing an important role on my farm. I saw in other countries the value that was put into these dung beetles by governments investing millions of dollars into mass rearing and releasing them out onto pasture. I also saw where anthelmintic resistance was further developed in other countries and the problems that it posed there and the strategies that farmers and vets were using together in order to combat the issues that they were experiencing from anthelmintic resistance. With the regulation coming in on the 1st of June, there might be a bit of confusion and anxiety about what's ahead of us, but we have a golden opportunity here to change the relationship the farmers and vets have together. We're currently working in a situation where a farmer rings a vet in a hurry because there's an emergency on the farm, and we're looking for the vet to fix the emergency, and the vet's a busy person. He doesn't want to get caught up in knowledge transfer. Now we can rethink this situation, and instead of paying vets to fix animals, we can pay vets to prevent problems. And sitting down over a cup of coffee at a table with a farmer at a time of the year that's not busy and coming up with an adaptable plan to protect these products is the opportunity that I see.